I've worked as a groundskeeper at a cemetery for almost 12 years. People always ask if it's creepy. Honestly, most of the time it's just maintenance work. Grass grows, trees need trimming, headstones get dirty. Families leave flowers that eventually wilt. The dead are usually the easiest part of the job. It's the living that cause problems. The cemetery sits on the edge of town, surrounded by old oak trees and rusted iron fencing. Some sections date back to the late 1800s. I've walked every inch of the property hundreds of times. I know every shortcut, every broken sprinkler, every headstone that's beginning to lean. And because I've spent so much time there, I notice when something feels wrong. The first sign appeared last October. A funeral had been held earlier that week. An elderly woman named Margaret Holloway. Nothing unusual about it. Large family, beautiful service, fresh flowers covering the grave. 3 days later, I was finishing my evening rounds near sunset when I noticed something strange. The flowers were gone. Not scattered, not stolen. Gone. I looked around and found them stacked neatly about 15 feet away beneath a tree. Every arrangement was carefully placed in a circle. It looked intentional, almost ceremonial. I assumed some teenagers were messing around. It wouldn't have been the first time. I carried the flowers back and thought nothing more about it. The next morning they had moved again. Same tree, same arrangement. Perfect circle. I called my supervisor. He walked over, looked at the flowers and shrugged. Kids. That was his answer for everything. Kids. I wasn't convinced. There hadn't been any footprints. The ground was still damp from rain. Anyone moving those flowers would have left tracks. But there were none. For the next week, the flowers continued moving every night. Always after dark, always beneath the same tree. Eventually, the family stopped replacing them. The grave sat undisturbed for a while. Then I noticed something worse. The dirt looked different. The center of the grave had sunk slightly. Not enough to alarm anyone, just enough to catch my attention. I grabbed a shovel and inspected the area. The soil felt loose, almost freshly turned. Yet no one had been authorized to work there. A few days later, another grave showed the same signs. Then another, then another. Each one located in a perfectly straight line stretching across the cemetery, like someone had connected them. I began checking security footage. Our cameras weren't great, most were decades old, but they covered enough ground to catch trespassers. Every morning I reviewed the recordings. Nothing. No people, no animals, no movement, just empty graves slowly changing. Then came the night that convinced me something was seriously wrong. I stayed late to repair a broken irrigation line. By the time I finished, darkness had fallen. The cemetery officially closed hours earlier. I was alone. At least I thought I was. I was packing tools into my truck when I heard something. A metallic sound, a hollow scrape, like metal dragging across stone. It came from Section E, the area with the disturbed graves. I grabbed a flashlight and walked toward the noise. The beam cut through the darkness. Rows of headstones emerged from the shadows. Everything seemed normal. Then I heard it again. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. Directly ahead. I moved closer. The sound stopped. Complete silence. Then my flashlight landed on Margaret Holloway's grave. The flowers had returned. Fresh flowers. Flowers that hadn't been there earlier that day. I froze. The arrangements looked brand new. Not wilted. Not damaged. Fresh. As if someone had purchased them that morning. Yet there was nobody around. I scanned the area. Nothing. Then my flashlight caught movement. The dirt. For just a second, I swear I saw the soil shift, not collapse. Move, like something underneath had pushed against it. I dropped the flashlight and ran. I didn't care how ridiculous it sounded. I got in my truck and left. The next day, I told my supervisor exactly what happened. He laughed, right up until he inspected the grave himself, because now the soil had collapsed inward. Not much, but enough to reveal a dark space below. The cemetery board approved an immediate investigation. A funeral home representative arrived, so did local police. The grave was carefully excavated. Everyone expected to find water damage or ground settling. Instead, they found something impossible. There was no coffin. The burial vault was empty, completely empty. No casket, no remains, nothing. The police immediately treated it as a crime scene. Records confirmed Margaret had been buried there. The funeral director personally identified the location, yet somehow the coffin was gone. That alone would have been disturbing. Then they opened the next grave in the line. Empty. The third, empty. The fourth, empty. 7 graves, 7 missing coffins. No tunnels, no signs of digging, no evidence anyone had entered or exited the graves. It made no sense. News crews arrived, families demanded answers. The cemetery board issued statements, police investigated for months. Nothing. No suspects, no explanations, no coffins. Eventually, the story faded. The graves were resealed. Families were compensated. Life moved on, at least for everyone else. I still worked there, and strange things kept happening. Flowers continued appearing on the empty graves, fresh flowers, every few weeks. No delivery records, no visitors captured on camera, nothing. Then, one winter morning, I discovered something that finally made me quit. Snow had fallen overnight. The entire cemetery was covered in white. No footprints anywhere, not a single track. But the empty graves had flowers on them again, fresh flowers sitting on top of untouched snow. And beside them were 7 depressions, perfectly shaped, like 7 people had stood there for a very long time. The impressions began at the graves, then continued across the cemetery. Not footprints, just standing marks, one after another, leading toward the old iron gate, the gate that had been locked all night. I followed them to the entrance. The final impression stopped directly in front of the gate, and written in the snow were 3 words. No footprints leading to them, no footprints leading away. Just 3 words scratched into the white surface. We went home. I resigned 2 days later. I've never gone back. But every now and then, I drive past the cemetery. And sometimes, usually just after sunset, I can see figures standing in Section E, 7 of them, perfectly still, surrounding those empty graves, waiting. The only reason I was at the cemetery that day was because my grandfather had died. He was 91 years old. Everyone in the family knew it was coming eventually. He'd spent the last few years slowing down. His memory wasn't what it used to be. His body hurt constantly, and he often joked that he was living on borrowed time. Still, knowing something is coming doesn't make it easier when it finally happens. The funeral took place on a cold afternoon in late November. Gray clouds covered the sky. The wind carried that damp chill that seems to settle directly into your bones. The cemetery sat on a hill outside town, surrounded by towering pine trees. It was beautiful in a sad sort of way, the kind of place you'd expect to find in a movie. The service lasted about an hour. Family members shared stories. People cried. Some laughed while remembering old memories. When the casket was lowered into the ground, my grandmother squeezed my hand so tightly it hurt. I didn't let go. Afterward, everyone slowly started leaving. Cars pulled away one by one. Relatives hugged each other. Plans for dinner were made. Eventually, there were only a handful of us left. My mom, my grandmother, my aunt, and me. The others headed to the reception. I stayed behind. I wanted a few minutes alone with Grandpa. He had practically raised me. When my parents worked late, he picked me up from school. When I got suspended in 8th grade, he was the one who talked to me. When my first girlfriend dumped me, he sat on his porch with me for 3 hours, pretending to fix an old radio while listening to me complain. He wasn't just my grandfather, he was one of my best friends, so I sat there quietly, just looking at the fresh dirt, trying to process the fact that he was gone. That's when I noticed another funeral taking place nearby. At first, it didn't seem unusual. Cemeteries have funerals every day, but something about this one felt wrong. There couldn't have been more than 6 people attending, all dressed in black, standing around a small white casket. The casket looked tiny, child-sized. A little girl, I assumed. The mourners stood perfectly still. No one spoke. No one cried. No one moved. They simply stared at the grave. For several minutes. My mother eventually walked over. "Ready to go?" I nodded and stood. As we walked toward the parking lot, I glanced back at the group. They hadn't moved an inch. The cemetery worker nearby seemed to be watching them too. His expression looked uneasy. I didn't think much of it until the following weekend. I returned alone to bring flowers to Grandpa's grave. The cemetery was mostly empty. A few visitors wandered between headstones. The sky was clear. Everything felt normal. As I approached Grandpa's section, I noticed the grave where the little girl's funeral had taken place. Something caught my eye. The headstone. It looked old, very old. The stone was weathered. The edges were worn smooth. Dark streaks stained the surface. It looked like it had been standing there for decades. That didn't make sense. The funeral had happened only a week earlier. Curious, I walked over. Then I read the inscription. Emily Harper, 1965 to 1972. I stared for several seconds. 7 years old, dead for over 50 years. My stomach tightened. Maybe I had the wrong grave. Maybe the funeral had been nearby. I looked around. No, this was the exact location. I remembered the white casket, the 6 mourners, everything. Confused, I found a groundskeeper working nearby, an older guy pushing a utility cart. I asked him about Emily Harper. The moment I said her name, his face changed. Not dramatically, just enough. Like someone hearing something they'd hoped not to hear again. "Why?" he asked. "I think I saw her funeral last week." The groundskeeper froze. Then he sighed. A long, tired sigh. "You're not the first person." I laughed nervously. "What does that mean?" He looked around before answering. "As crazy as this sounds, people report seeing that funeral every few years." I smiled, assuming he was joking. He wasn't. "The same little girl?" He nodded. "The same casket, same mourners, same location." "That's impossible." "I agree." I left feeling unsettled, but I didn't believe him. There had to be some explanation. Maybe local folklore, maybe a prank, maybe mass suggestion. A week later, I decided to investigate. I know that sounds stupid. It probably was. But curiosity got the better of me. I arrived shortly before sunset. The cemetery officially closed at dusk. I parked near the entrance and waited. Nothing happened. The sun slowly disappeared behind the trees. Shadows stretched across the graves. Visitors left one by one. Soon I was alone. Then I saw them. The 6 mourners, standing beside Emily Harper's grave. Exactly where I'd seen them before. My heart nearly stopped. They hadn't walked into the cemetery. I never saw them arrive. One moment the area was empty. The next they were there, all dressed in black, all standing perfectly still. A small white casket rested between them. I pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking. I snapped several photographs. Then I started recording video. The figures didn't react, didn't acknowledge me, didn't move. The entire scene felt wrong, like watching a paused movie. After a few minutes, fear finally overpowered curiosity. I got in my car and left. The moment I reached home, I checked the footage. The video showed the cemetery, the grave, the trees, everything except the funeral. The 6 mourners were gone. The casket was gone. The footage showed an empty patch of grass. I replayed it over and over. Nothing. The same thing happened with the photographs. Every single image showed empty ground. I barely slept that night. Over the following months, I became obsessed. I researched Emily Harper, old newspaper archives, library records, historical documents. Eventually, I found an article from 1972. A tragic story. Emily had disappeared while playing near the woods. Hundreds of volunteers searched for her. Her body was discovered 3 days later. The official cause of death was exposure. The case was considered closed, but another article caught my attention. One written a few months later. The cemetery had accidentally buried the wrong child. A paperwork error. The wrong remains had been placed inside Emily's grave. By the time the mistake was discovered, the correct body could no longer be located. Officials quietly covered it up. The article ended there. No further updates. No corrections. Nothing. Years passed. Life moved on. I stopped thinking about it, at least until last spring. My grandmother passed away. The funeral was held at the same cemetery. I hadn't been there in almost 5 years. After the service, I found myself standing near Grandpa's grave again, just like before. The memories came flooding back. Emily, the funeral, the photographs, everything. Then I saw them. The 6 mourners, standing among the graves, exactly as before. Not older, not different. The same people, the same black clothing, the same white casket. My blood ran cold, because this time, they weren't standing around Emily's grave. They were standing around my grandmother's. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. One of the figures slowly turned toward me. For the first time, someone acknowledged my presence. The figure raised a hand and pointed, not at the grave, at me. The others followed, one by one, 6 pale faces turning in my direction, 6 fingers pointing. Then they vanished, not walked away, not faded, gone, like someone switched off a television screen. I stood there frozen, terrified. Eventually, I forced myself to leave. I haven't returned since, but every year around the anniversary of Grandpa's funeral, something arrives in my mailbox. No return address, no postage, just an old black and white photograph. Every photo shows a funeral, 6 mourners, a white casket, and one additional person standing among them. The first year it was a stranger. The second year another stranger. The third year another. The fourth year it was my grandmother. Last year it was my mother. And this year, for the first time, the person standing beside the casket was me. When I was a teenager, my friends and I used to spend almost every weekend hanging out in an old cemetery. I know how that sounds. We weren't trying to be edgy. We weren't ghost hunters. The cemetery just happened to sit behind an abandoned church at the edge of town, and it was one of the few places where nobody bothered us. There was a small wooded area nearby, a creek behind the property, and enough open space that we could sit around talking for hours. Looking back, it was probably a strange place for a group of teenagers to spend so much time. At the time, it felt normal. There were 4 of us: me, Tyler, Brandon, and Eric. Almost every Friday night we'd bring snacks, climb over the old stone wall, and wander between the graves. Most of the headstones were ancient. Some dated back to the late 1800s. Others were so weathered you couldn't read the names anymore. We used to make up stories about the people buried there, who they were, how they died, whether they were related to each other. Typical dumb teenager stuff. One grave always stood out. The headstone wasn't particularly large, and actually it was one of the smaller ones, but for some reason all of us noticed it. The name read Daniel Cross, 1987 to 2012. The strange part wasn't the name, it was the flowers. Every single time we visited, there were fresh flowers sitting in front of the grave. Not every few weeks, not every month. Every time. It didn't matter if we visited on a Tuesday or a Saturday, rain or shine. Fresh flowers, sometimes roses, sometimes lilies, sometimes bouquets that looked like they had been purchased that same day. Eventually it became a running joke. If somebody got a bad grade, Daniel Cross did it. Lost your phone? Ask Daniel. Car won't start? Daniel's angry. The joke got so common that we'd actually stop by his grave every time we visited. It became part of the routine. Looking back, that's probably why we noticed something else. Someone was leaving notes. Tiny folded pieces of paper tucked beneath the flowers. Most were ruined by weather, but occasionally we'd find one that was still readable. They were always short, simple messages. Miss you. Thinking about you. Wish you were here. Nothing unusual. Just the sort of thing grieving family members might write. Then one night we found a different note. One that made all of us uncomfortable. It simply read, "Thank you for helping me." We laughed it off. But something about it felt strange. Helping with what? The following week, another note appeared. "Thank you for watching over me." Then another. "Thank you for keeping your promise." Those didn't sound like messages written to the dead. They sounded like messages written to someone still involved in their lives. After that, we stopped reading them. The cemetery slowly became less interesting. We graduated, got jobs, went to college. Life happened. Eventually, years passed without any of us returning. I completely forgot about Daniel Cross. Until last year, I had just started a new job at a software company. First day, new office, new co-workers. The usual awkward introductions. Around lunch, I met a guy from another department. Friendly, funny, easy to talk to. He stuck out because he looked familiar somehow. Not someone I'd met before, just familiar. Then he introduced himself. Daniel Cross. My stomach dropped. I actually laughed, and not because it was funny, because it felt weird, really weird. Of all the names in the world, Daniel Cross. The same name I'd spent years joking about in that cemetery. He noticed my reaction. "Everything okay?" I told him about the grave, the cemetery, the flowers, the running joke. The moment I finished speaking, his smile disappeared. Just for a second. Then it returned. "That's strange," he said, very calmly, too calmly. I asked how old he was. 38. The exact age Daniel Cross would be today. Again, probably a coincidence, but it bothered me. Over the next few months, we became friends. At least work friends. The more I got to know him, the stranger things felt. He never talked about family, never talked about his childhood, never discussed where he grew up. Every conversation somehow avoided personal details. Whenever someone asked, he'd redirect the topic. Most people never noticed. I did. Then came the company holiday party. A few drinks loosened everyone up. One of our coworkers asked Daniel where he was from. For the first time, he actually answered. The town he named was my hometown. The exact town with the cemetery. Now my skin was crawling. After the party, I decided to visit the cemetery for the first time in over 15 years. The place looked smaller than I remembered. Older. The church had collapsed. Most of the stone wall had fallen apart, but Daniel's grave was still there. Fresh flowers rested against the stone. Just like always. I walked closer. Then I noticed something I had never paid attention to as a teenager. A photograph. A small oval picture attached to the headstone. The man in the photo wasn't my coworker, at least not exactly. He looked older, different hairstyle, different expression, but the resemblance was unbelievable. Same eyes, same face, same smile, like a father and son. That's when I noticed the inscription beneath the name, Beloved Father. I stood there staring. Father, not son, father. A horrible realization began forming in my head. I searched public records that night. Hours of digging eventually revealed the truth. Daniel Cross had a son named after him, Daniel Cross Jr. In 1999, 11-year-old Daniel disappeared. No suspects, no witnesses, no body. The case was never solved. I stared at the missing person photograph. The age progression image looked almost identical to my coworker, the same coworker who claimed to be 38, the same coworker who came from my hometown, the same coworker who shared the exact name. The next morning I confronted him. I waited until everyone else had left for lunch. Then I showed him the records, the missing child report, the photographs, everything. For several seconds, he simply stared at them. Then he smiled, not nervous, not surprised, amused, like someone hearing a joke. "You figured it out," he said. I asked him who he really was. He leaned back in his chair, still smiling. Then he said something I'll never forget. "You ever wonder why there were always fresh flowers?" I didn't answer. "You kids weren't the only ones visiting." My heart started pounding. "What does that mean?" His smile widened. "Every week. Every single week." He stood up, slowly, calmly, like he'd been expecting this conversation. Then he walked toward the office door. Before leaving, he stopped, turned around, and said, "My father made a promise." I asked what promise. His expression changed. For the first time, he looked angry. Not furious, just cold. Very cold. He promised he'd never let them find me. Then he left. I never saw him again. He didn't return to work. His apartment had been emptied. His phone disconnected, his email deleted. It was like he never existed. A few weeks later, curiosity got the better of me one final time. I returned to the cemetery. Daniel Cross's grave looked exactly the same. Fresh flowers, perfectly arranged, but now there were 2 bouquets, one on each side of the headstone, and between them sat a folded note. I opened it, and inside was a single sentence. The same handwriting from years ago. "Thank you for keeping our secret. I don't know who wrote it. I don't know who left it. But when I looked down at the fresh dirt surrounding the grave, I noticed something that made me leave immediately. There was a second name carved into the back of the headstone, one facing away from visitors, a name nobody would ever see unless they walked behind it. Daniel Cross Jr. No birth date, no death date, just a name. And beneath it, reserved.